I've been hyping myself up for the release of Evil West for a while now. It looks great, right? But it's still a ways off with no concrete release date in sight, so I went ahead and I figured, with the Weird West genre making a bit of a comeback, why not take a look at Darkwatch, Curse of the West? So Darkwatch is set in 1876 Arizona. You play as Jericho Cross, a train robber who tries to rob the Darkwatch, unknowingly releases Lazarus, this powerful ancient demon, and with that an entire army of the undead. A Darkwatch regulator named Cassidy and you get into a short scuffle with Lazarus, but you guys are no match. Darkwatch are sort of like bounty hunters, but for creatures. So Lazarus attacks Jericho and spreads his curse to him. And so for the next hour or so, Cassidy leads you to the Darkwatch headquarters. And after a painful initiation, you're the newest member of the Darkwatch. You're a regulator. You're paired up with your new boss, Tala, a leather-clad temptress. Throughout the game, you struggle with who you were before the bite versus who you are now. And with that, you're given moral choices to side with good or evil, and these contribute to your active abilities. For example, you can choose to put someone injured out of their misery and be good, or you can choose to infect them with the curse and be evil. There are judgments that are impossible to miss, that liberally fill up your bar, and there are smaller offerings scattered around the levels that you can miss that are more conservative with how much they fill your bar. I found the abilities to be a bit of a mixed bag overall, but I'd like to explain that more in detail. So starting with the evil side, Blood Frenzy gives you a one-hit melee kill. After that, you unlock Turn, which causes enemies to attack each other for a short period of time. After that, you get Black Shard, which makes you impervious to damage for a bit, and whatever damage dealt to you is dished back at your enemy. And finally, after this, you get Soul Stealer, which sends out a shockwave and turns enemies to clouds of blood. And we'll go ahead and switch over to the good side. Silver Bullet is the first unlock. This gives your weapon of choice unlimited ammo and a damage buff. Next up, Fear causes enemies to simply run away from you. After this, you unlock Mystic Armor, which is just another invincibility shield but doesn't dish out damage. Lastly, you unlock Vindicator, which sends out Chain Lightning and destroys everything in front of you. So between all of these, funny enough, I found Silver Bullet to be the most useful, I know, right? I'd equip the Redeemer or dual pistols and just unload on my opponents. Fear and Turn were probably used maybe 10 times between the two of them. I just didn't find much utility for them. The larger enemies typically just shrug off both, and those were kind of the enemies I wanted to turn the most, so. The two shield abilities I didn't use often either, but they were useful for some of the boss fights. It made it so I didn't have to worry about their attacks, I could just tank them. I didn't unlock the last two abilities on either side on my first playthrough, and so they were just sort of a fun novelty to screw around with later on. Whenever I went back into the game, I just kinda, unlocked them and screwed around a bit with them just to capture some footage, but I didn't really get to use them in my normal playthrough. You do have certain abilities that aren't tied to the judgment system. You have a double jump, which does come in handy for certain parts of levels, but I didn't find it all that useful, really. First off, it feels like you're on the moon with this thing. It's just too floaty, and I struggled to incorporate it into my combat routine, but it was useful for platforming. You also have a secondary health bar called the Blood Shield. It sort of operates like the two bars in Halo, where one is a shield and the other is your health. Your armor does regenerate, but your health does not. Your health bar requires pickups, and the most common being the blood clouds you've probably seen in the video from defeated enemies, but you can also find these blood canteens around the level that fill your bar up more. In addition to healing you, blood also serves a secondary purpose, and that fills up your blood bar you see right here when your health is full. And the blood bar is just what fuels your active powers, like the blood frenzy and such. Moving along to the shooting, it feels pretty good. The shooting feels pretty good. There's a fair amount of gore in the game where you can blow off limbs and heads and rip apart some of the larger enemies. Enemies also ragdoll and fly all over the place, so it makes gunplay feel a bit more satisfying. Most of the weapons serve a distinct purpose. The Redeemer is the standard issue Darkwatch weapon. It's what you'll have on every mission you go on, and it's a handgun that you're able to fan by holding down the right trigger. It's pretty devastating at close range, and so are the dual pistols. Fire rate on those is the highest in the game, but that does come at the cost of recoil, so you want to be pretty close when you use these. Next up, the carbine. It's a semi-auto, pretty decent at all ranges, but it wasn't really my first choice for any of them. It just kind of was there. It's an all-around decent weapon. Moving along to the range rifle. It excels at long range. It's the only weapon with a scope. It's extremely ineffective at short, medium distances, but I mean, that's fine, right? Most of the combat does take place in that short to medium range, though, so it's very situational. Next up, we have the shotgun, and I gotta say, I love shotguns in FPS games. They're usually what I gravitate towards, and my rating of this one is, it's okay. It's a quad barrel. It looks really cool. Has a fairly fast fire rate. It sounds okay, but I didn't find it that powerful. It's devastating up close, don't get me wrong, but at that medium range where I still want to see shotguns be somewhat powerful, it just wasn't. And that's such a bummer for me, really, because like I've said, I love these really powerful, beefy shotguns in video games, and I gravitate towards them, and it just didn't scratch that itch. Moving along to the crossbow, I didn't even really use it, honestly. I used it when they first introduced it, and I found out I was blowing myself up more often than the enemies, so I dropped it. It's weak damage output, but seemingly that damage quadruples near you, so I'll pass. Now moving along to the rail rocket. Talk about power. Not only is it a rocket launcher, but it's a super powerful melee weapon too. And on top of this, if you hold down the right trigger, you can control the trajectory of the rocket. It's pretty cool. I like it a lot. I got a lot of time out of this one. You also have dynamite sticks that you can throw. It took me a while to really nail the trajectory of these things, since you throw them so far above your head, but once I did, they were a useful asset in my arsenal. And you really need them too, because unfortunately, Darkwatch is one of those games where it has a 2-weapon limit, and it being a console-only shooter, I would have hoped for a weapon wheel at least. That'd have been great, right? You know, being able to switch on the fly to whatever weapon you want, depending on the situation, but instead you kind of have to play to the weapon's strengths. And like, for example, if you rolled out with a Redeemer and dual pistols, then you're going to want to try to get enemies into that closer range towards you, or you're going to have to walk around and try to find a longer range weapon on the ground, so kind of a bummer, but it is what it is. There does come a time in the story where you'll be able to choose your primary weapon from a list, and like I said, you'll roll out with the Redeemer and you'll have some dynamite with you. But this is sort of where the game, to me, took a bit of a nosedive. See, Darkwatch is primarily a linear game, and it's told in a linear structure. But this part in the Citadel, however, you're presented with 3 missions, and each can be played in whichever order you please. Now, that seems okay on the surface, but there's no reason for any of this because you have to play all 3 anyway. None of these missions play a vital role in the story either. It's just really busy work. I suppose it's building your trust with leadership or whatever. I don't know. I'm not sure, but the missions, all of them were grating. There's one in particular that got on my nerves more than the others, where you're out in the sunlight with other Darkwatch regulators, and remember, you're like a half-breed human vampire hybrid. So this is the only time in the game beyond the tutorial where the light even plays a significant role in the gameplay. The rest of the game takes place at night. While you're in the light, you have none of your powers active or passive. No double jumps, no blood shield, nothing. So to use any of your powers, you have to hide in these little tiny slivers of shadow pockets around the level. You just completely lose your mobility, and it doesn't make for a fun experience. All 3 of these levels, I haven't discussed the other 2, but I just can't help feeling like they're filler, really. I mean, once you're done with them, the mission selection system never returns again, and the main storyline continues, and the game is linear again. The game with them lasted me about 6 hours on my first playthrough, so shaving an hour and a half or so off for those missions, I think would have been acceptable considering the time, this was released 2005. Shooters back then, they lasted 4 to 5 hours each regularly. I mean, it wasn't uncommon. So anyways, moving along, I would really like to talk about the last few hours of the game's story and gameplay. I think it's important to the review, so if you'd like to skip past this point, go to this point in the video. So by this point, you're a little over halfway through the game. You're an established Darkwatch regulator, and you've completed multiple objectives for them. There's a bit of tension growing in the Darkwatch over Jericho's involvement and some of his tactics. So Tala sees this weakness and she seduces you. It went that way. I've played a lot of games in my time, but this has to be one of the more awkward sex scenes out there. So yeah. Turns out though, she used you, and she just wanted to be infected with Lazarus' curse for her own needs. So you wake up from your slumber, and the Citadel is under attack from the army of the undead. After you repel their attack, you finally confront Lazarus. And up until this point, I thought for sure he was going to be the final boss, but it turns out he wasn't. So after the fight, you're given the most important choice up until this point in the game. You can choose to break the curse, or you can choose to kill Lazarus and absorb his power for yourself. Now, every good or evil choice you've made up until this point has no bearing on the ending. So this is entirely what decides which ending you get and what boss you fight. So, essentially, you're choosing between good and evil, Cassidy or Tala. So, whichever one you go against, however, is the one you fight at the end, like I said. So, I decided to fight both for the sake of the video. You're welcome. So, I'll briefly talk about both. So, on my first playthrough, I sided with Tala, and so I had to fight Cassidy. Cassidy was a fairly straightforward boss. She kind of just flies around and she throws these orbs at you. And as you lower her health bar, she mixes her attacks up. So, eventually, she'll send out a single orb that drains your health over time that you can shoot, and she sends out these columns of lightning that you have to sidestep. After this, the cutscene plays. I was genuinely shocked by the betrayal. I really thought they were going to ride off into the sunset together, but yeah, no, badass ending. Loved it. So after I went ahead and composed my thoughts after that, I went back and I fought Tala. And Tala is essentially the same, but there are some mild differences in her attacks. She does throw this cloud of blood at you, and you have to double jump over it. So I found that the best way to get around it was to jump backwards once and then jump forward for my double jump. I could have probably just, you know, double jumped in place, but I wanted to give myself a little more room for the attack. But I did find Tala to be more difficult since her projectiles move faster. So take that as you will. After defeating her, the curse is lifted and Jericho says goodbye to Cassidy in this ending. And I thought it was cheesy. I didn't care for this ending as much. I much preferred the evil ending, and I think that if the game ever did get a sequel, it probably would have followed this version of the events. I can imagine maybe a former surviving member of the Darkwatch recruiting new members to kill Jericho or something. I can't visualize an ending where Jericho ends the curse unless they introduce other demons similar to Lazarus with their own curses. I don't know. At that point, it's like, why even bother, right? So, in conclusion, a sequel was supposed to release on the then next-gen 360 and PS3, but it never happened. I also read that a Darkwatch movie was planned at one time. That would have been pretty cool, but that never happened either. I thought that Capcom and High Moon built a pretty solid game here to build a franchise off of. It's not perfect, but it's a good foundation, and I do like to say that. I'm comfortable in saying that, so maybe someday we'll get a remake or a remaster, but I suppose until then this is gonna have to do, right? Darkwatch is solid but flawed. It really kept my butt in the seat, and that's a win to me. If you're like me and you're waiting for Evil West to release, check out Darkwatch. I don't think you'll be disappointed.
Lazarus is cursed, Jericho. There's nothing you could have done. It's not your fault.